Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Appalachian Mountains. These aren't urban legends or made-up stories. These are unvarnished, unadulterated accounts from people whose experiences in those old hills profoundly impacted their lives. Because they want others to know that America's oldest mountain range is home to something genuinely eerie. Each person reached out to tell their story, 4 real horror stories that will give you the chills. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to Untold Fears to ensure you never miss the moment when true dread calls your name. Press the notification bell. Let's now hear from 10 courageous people who have shared their most eerie Appalachian experiences, where the mountains appear to be watching. And certain experiences create wounds that never go away. Just 6 months have passed since what I'm going to tell you occurred, and I still have trouble falling asleep at night. Even in my own house, I feel like I'm being watched all the time. I'm sure I'll never return, even if I'm not sure if what I saw in those mountains was human or something else. I'm Sarah, and I feel compelled to share this as perhaps someone else has gone through what I did. Perhaps someone can tell me what's still after me. For more than 15 years, I have been trekking the Appalachian trails. I'm not a weekend warrior who loses themselves in Instagram pictures. I am very familiar with these mountains, or I believe that I did. I hold a certification as a wilderness guide. I've spent many nights in the backcountry by myself without experiencing any discomfort, and I have the appropriate equipment. I've always found refuge in the mountains, a haven from the bustle of daily life. When it's just my pack, me, and the never-ending ridgeline that stretches out to the horizon, I feel most at ease. This specific journey was intended to be a 3-day camping vacation for one person in a secluded area of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. Maybe a dozen hikers used the trail I picked each month. It's the type of environment where you can hike 4 days and not see anyone, with the leaves just beginning to change and that fresh mountain air that gives you a sense of life. It was early October and the ideal time of year for trekking. I had already completed this exact route twice, so I was familiar with all the water sources, decent camping locations, and challenging trail sections. On a Friday morning, I parked at the little gravel lot that designates the trailhead and began my journey. It can only be securely reached with 4-wheel drive due to the poor maintenance of the Forest Service road that leads to it. I experienced that same feeling of calm and exhilaration as I locked my Jeep and shouldered my pack. My element was this: I was supposed to be here. Everything about the first day was flawless. I appreciated the hike and had a fantastic time. Seclusion. I made tent at my prearranged location, a tiny clearing next to a mountain stream some 8 miles away. I prepared dinner, set up my tent, filtered the water, and got comfortable for what I hoped would be a quiet evening. The creeks babble, the leaves rustle in the light wind, and the occasional owl's hoot were the only sounds. However, I had a strange feeling that first night as I sat by my little campfire. At first, I was unable to identify it. It was quieter than normal in the forest. There was an eerie silence that made me more conscious of every sound I made, without any night. Birds calling to one another or little animals darting through the underbrush. The crinkle of my jacket seemed strangely loud when I moved. The pop of burning wood reverberated oddly through the trees as I stirred the fire. I put it all in my head and went to bed at around 10 o'clock. However, I kept waking up throughout that first night, not because of discomfort or nightmares, but rather because I had the persistent sensation that someone was watching me. Have you ever had the feeling that someone is looking at you from the other side of the room? It was similar, but more intense. I would listen carefully while lying motionless in my sleeping bag, but I would not hear anything unusual. Beautiful weather arrived on Saturday morning. Weather, and I told myself that I had just been experiencing first night jitters. The great solitude of the deep woods can occasionally frighten even seasoned hikers. Following a track that would lead me to my next intended campground, approximately 10 miles further in, I broke camp early and proceeded deeper into the mountains. Things began to go wrong at that point. I was enjoying a water break on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley below at around noon, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, just a dim glimpse of something dark between the trees, only 100 yards distant. I looked straight ahead, but there was nothing. I spent a few minutes examining the area, wondering if I might have spotted a bear or a deer, but the woodland was motionless. It occurred once more an hour later. This time, I was positive that I spotted a tall, dark-clad figure traveling 50 yards to my left along the route. However, my voice went ignored when I halted and said, "Hello, is someone there?" The ensuing quiet was so heavy that it seemed as though the forest as a whole was holding its breath. I attempted to explain it. Perhaps another hiker was using a different path. Perhaps I was seeing clouds moving and casting shadows. However, my instincts, the same instincts that had protected me 4 years in the wilderness, were warning me that something was off. I arrived at my intended campsite for the second night by late afternoon. Another little clearing. This one was encircled on 3 sides by tall hemlocks that form natural walls. Although I had previously camped here and felt safe, the surrounding woods now felt more like a trap than a barrier. Something I saw while erecting my tent chilled my blood. Footprints were found in the soft ground next to the fire ring. New ones, unquestionably not my boot prints. Bigger and featuring a distinct tread design. This clearing had recently been visited by someone. I just tried to convince myself that everything was the prints went around my tent spot several times, as though someone had been wandering around and examining the scene. But he was simply another hiker who had visited the location before continuing. None of the apparent tracks had prints leading away from the clearing. My world really started to descend into nightmare zone on the second night. I did not construct a fire. I had a gut feeling that I should remain anonymous and not make more of an impression than was absolutely necessary. As night fell, I ate a cold dinner in my tent. Every sense was sharpened, and every shadow was suspicious. Now there was total quiet. No nightbirds, no insects, nothing. The whole ecosystem of the woodland seemed to have fled from something. I heard it for the first time at midnight. Steps, footsteps moving slowly and deliberately around my camp. As though whatever was out there understood I wasn't going anywhere. They moved purposefully, but without rush. The steps would always stay at the same precise distance from my tent, pausing for several minutes before continuing. I clutched my knife while I lay motionless in my sleeping bag, gasping for air. For what seemed like hours, the footsteps persisted. I never heard voices, but sometimes they seemed to emanate from different directions, like there were numerous people out there. I've never heard the typical noises individuals make while they're at night in the forest. With trembling hands, I unzipped my tent as daylight finally broke. The previous night's footsteps had vanished, replaced by fresh ones. Some of these were driven so deeply into the ground that it seemed like something very heavy had produced them, while others circled even closer to my tent. I quickly packed my belongings and set off on my hike. I had intended to stay an additional night, but my entire being was urging me to leave those mountains right away. The path, it was 12 miles, back to my car, and I wanted to go as quickly as I could. The forest, however, had other ideas. I discovered I was lost about 4 miles into my hike. The path that I had previously traversed numerous times appeared to have undergone a sudden transformation. I couldn't find the markers I remembered. Where the trail had never split before, it did so now. My GPS device indicated that I was in an impossible place. The gadget said that I was standing in the center of a fictitious lake. When I realized I was being harmed, panic started to set in. With each incorrect turn, I ventured farther into unmarked wilderness. Each time I attempted to retrace my steps, the path behind me appeared different than it had only minutes before. Then I caught sight of my stalker. About 200 yards distant, it stood motionless on a ridge, observing me. I was unable to see details at that distance, but it was unquestionably tall, human-shaped, and dressed in dark attire that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I waved with my hand, but it didn't react. I yelled, but it remained motionless. It did nothing but observe. I took off running. I smashed through the brush, completely leaving the track behind, and started toward what I assumed was my car. Branches ripped at my rucksack and clothes. My hands and legs scraped on rocks and roots as I fell several times. I heard something following behind me, just keeping the same steady pace, not running, as though it was aware that it didn't have to hurry. I stumbled into a gravel road I didn't recognize after several hours of exhaustion and confusion, but it was a road that signified civilization. I pursued it until I discovered a residence where the occupants made a call. The sheriff on my behalf. I was talking incoherently about being stalked and followed in the woods when the deputy showed there. 2 days later, the search and rescue crew located my Jeep. Several pieces of equipment that had been safely stored in my tent were gone, as was my 3-day supply of food. According to the deputy, it appeared as though someone had been camping in my equipment for weeks, but that was not feasible. I had barely spent 2 days in the woods. I'm still baffled by what transpired in those mountains. I'm not sure how. My equipment ended up strewn all over a campsite I had never seen before, or how I got lost on a trail I knew by heart. I am unable to elucidate the person that observed me from the ridgeline or the footprints that came and went, but I am positive of one thing. Those old mountains beckon me to stay for some reason. Something that doesn't leave typical traces or appear on maps. Something that continues to murmur from unnatural shadows, calling my name on calm nights. Since then, I've relocated twice, yet the monitoring continues. I also swear I smell hemlock and mountain air leaking under my door at night when I'm by myself in my apartment. I still have cold chills when I wake up, even though this was 3 years ago. I know what I saw in that hollow, but my family believes I'm going insane. I unintentionally disturbed something that should have remained buried in the Appalachian. I'm Marcus, and I once had a strong interest in genealogy research. It was certain family history intended to remain undiscovered. I had been researching my mother's side of the family for 5 years, going back through generations of Appalachian settlers, using paper trails and cemetery records. Although it's laborious, I enjoyed the detective element of it, assembling lives from birth certificates, faded photos, and bits and pieces of paperwork. Abigail Thornton, my great-great-grandmother, had always been a mystery. In 1890, she was listed in the census as my great-great-grandfather's wife, living in a secluded glen in eastern Kentucky. Before that, there was no record of her, no familial ties, no birth certificate, nothing. She seemed to have appeared out of thin air. I eventually made a breakthrough after months of fruitless attempts. Through a genealogical forum, a distant cousin claimed to know the location of Abigail's original homestead, in a hollow so far away from the Daniel Boone National Forest that it was not shown on contemporary maps. According to him, his granddad had been keeping meticulous records of all the old families and their homes for decades, serving as the unofficial historian of the area. Ezra Caldwell was his name, and he had that characteristic mountain accent that spoke of generations steeped in those hills when we talked on the phone. Despite the fact that the Forest Service road to the trailhead was nearly impassable and the hike was challenging, he offered to bring me to the homestead. His enthusiasm for helping someone conduct study on the area's history felt genuine, and his knowledge of the area seemed to be encyclopedic. We agreed to meet at a service station in the tiny village of Whitesburg on a Saturday morning in October. With my laptop, portable scanner, and camera equipment, I drove out from Ohio with the intention of spending the day recording what was left of Abigail's house and perhaps discovering some family relics that would complete the missing pieces of her story. Ezra was just what I had anticipated. In his 70s, a wiry man with keen blue eyes and worn hands seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a plaid shirt that had seen better decades, worn pants, and work boots. He told me that his pickup truck was the only vehicle that could go where we were heading, even though it appeared to have been driving mountain roads since the Carter era. It took about an hour to go to the trailhead on roads that were getting progressively narrower and worse as coal mining crept into the area in the early 1900s. Ezra filled the time with tales of the old families who had established these hollows in the 1800s, their conflicts and tragedies, and how the majority of the homesteads had been abandoned. He was particularly knowledgeable about Abigail's family, bringing up information about their home and way of life that I couldn't find in any of the documents I had located. He claimed that, as we bounced over a particularly rough stretch of road, the Thorntons stayed to themselves. They were, even by mountain standards, private people. Silas, Abigail's father, was known for handling matters that other people avoided, issues that, if you understand what I mean, the church was unable to resolve. He simply shook his head and stated that some stories were better left untold when I pressed him for specifics. At a road widening where the forest crowded in from all sides, we parked at what hardly constituted a trailhead. Ezra led me along what may have been a logging road, but was now merely a deer path. After shouldering a battered canvas pack, the air in October was the scent of fading leaves, crisp and fragrant, and I experienced the well-known thrill of historical discovery for the first mile or two. However, something started to seem off as we went farther down into the depression. It was too quiet in the forest. No rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no bird sounds. I felt like whispering because of the stifling silence that muffles even our footsteps. We had been trekking for about 2 hours when I inquired, how much further? Ezra grimaced and looked at his watch. It ought to have arrived by now. These ancient routes occasionally change. I'll locate it, so don't worry. After an additional hour of hiking, we arrived at a clearing that left me speechless, but not for the reasons I had anticipated. A 2-story log cottage that appeared to have been constructed just yesterday stood in the middle of the hollow. There was a new chinking between the logs. There were no noticeable chips or cracks in the glass windows, reflecting the afternoon sunlight, and the roof was undamaged by the elements. I said, "This can't be right," and I walked carefully up. Ezra had been quite quiet behind the scenes. "This house is supposed to be over a century old," he whispered. This ain't. How it was last time I was here." And his face had gotten pale when I turned to face him. The front porch groaned under my weight as I approached it, but it felt sturdy and brand new. The door was not locked. Inside, rays of sunlight entering through spotless windows caused dust motes to dance. However, the dust itself was incorrect, as opposed to the dense, untouched strata that one might anticipate in an abandoned home. It was merely a thin layer, as though someone had just moved in and left for a few days. Although the furniture was in unbelievably good condition, it was era-appropriate state. In the middle of the main room was a crudely hung table, with cups and tin dishes set out as though for a family dinner. Near the door, clothes were hung on wooden pegs, dresses for women with cloth that is faded but still intact, work shirts for men that still had a slight wood smoke and perspiration odor. I called Ezra, but nobody answered. He was standing at the tree line, staring at the house with an expression I couldn't read when I stepped back outside. "We need to document everything," I stated as I took out my camera. "This is amazing." I tried turning on my camera, but nothing occurred. It's like a perfectly preserved time capsule. The device was dead, yet the battery indicated full charge. According to the bars, my phone was still fully signaled. However, the screen became black when I attempted to take a picture. I became aware of the footsteps at that point. There were new boot prints, recent ones, on the soft ground near the foundation of the hut. A woman, most likely, had been moving about the house on little feet. The prints took the lead. They led to different windows as though someone had been gazing inside, but there was no obvious route to leave the house. "Do you notice this, Ezra?" However, he was gone when I turned around. I yelled his name over and over, my voice oddly resonating off the nearby hills. In the jungle, there was no reaction, no noise of movement. He seemed to have just disappeared. I made the decision to keep recording the site despite my panic. I would take handwritten notes and look for family relics that could help explain the house's impossibly poor state if my devices weren't functioning. Within, I found a small stairway that led to the second story. The steps felt sturdy beneath my feet and had not worn or aged. I discovered two bedrooms upstairs, each with a plain wooden bed and a freshly made-looking quilt. I found them in what looked like the main bedroom, on a little dresser of family photos. However, they had a terrible problem. The faces in each picture were scraped out with what appeared to be fingernails. Images of persons dressed in medieval attire were visible through deep gouges in the glass, but frantic scratching had wiped off their features. I picked up a single picture with trembling hands. In front of this exact house, a man, mother, and 3 children were pictured in a family portrait. Their attire suggested that it was from the 1890s. Although the woman's face was utterly ruined, I could see enough of the male to recognize some of my own features. I heard the voices downstairs. At that point, up from the main room came muffled talk, a woman's voice and a man's whispering urgently about something. I slipped to the top of the stairs and listened, but I was unable to understand what was being said. The voices were weird and distorted, like if they were coming from underwater. I said, "Hello, down below. Down below. Is someone there?" The conversation came to a sudden halt, and I was left in a complete silence that made me feel as though a weight was bearing down on me. Slowly, I made my way down the stairs, each step seeming to reverberate in the suddenly empty house. The main chamber was deserted, but the wooden floor was now covered in new muddy footprints. Minutes before, there had been no prints. I saw the basement door at that moment, positioned close to the rear on the floor. There was a big wooden trapdoor on the wall that I swear wasn't there when I initially walked inside the house. It stood open, exposing wooden steps that vanished into the shadows below. I was walking toward that aperture against all my instincts, which were telling me to run. The voices had become clearer and more distinct as they came from down there. An argument between a man and a woman about something that needed to be stopped before it spread. I used the flashlight feature on my dead phone, which for some reason now worked, to descend the stairs. The basement extended back into shadows and was bigger than the house's footprint should have permitted. My light was ineffective. The air smelt of earth and another scent, something sweet and earthy, and the walls were made of rough stone, decaying. Shelves with glass jars holding items I didn't want to take a close look at ran along the far wall. A wooden table in the middle of the space was etched with symbols I couldn't identify and was discolored by what appeared to be rust but wasn't. Dozens other journals, all written in the same feminine handwriting, were also strewn all over the table. My hands were shaking when I opened the top journal. Only 3 days have passed since the initial entry was made. He will return. I sense him drawing nearer. The lineage is nearly finished. After that, I'll have time to relax. The final one is Marcus. It will all be done when he gets there. In a journal that appeared to be a century old, My name was scribbled in fading writing. I turned to page after page of entries from decades ago, all of them about relatives who had returned to the hollow. Records of my grandfather's 1962 visit, during which he decided to remain, regarding my great-uncle's arrival in 1983, after he realized his mission. Yesterday was the last entry. Like the rest, Ezra brought him. The door is ajar. The family can once more be complete. The cellar door above me slammed shut at that moment. Running up the steps, I pushed as hard as I could against the trapdoor, but it remained in place. It had been set on top of something hefty. Something far more substantial than furnishings. I heard footsteps circling the house from above, several sets of footsteps. They were all circling the basement door, some heavy, others light. Additionally, my family's voices. My grandfather, who passed away when I was 12, was calling my name. I recalled the sound of my great-uncle laughing during visits as a child, and the kind, patient voice of a woman. Marcus, come upstairs. Time to return home. Time to become a member of the family. As the voices above became more demanding, I worked, quickly, using my keys to chip away at the masonry around the back wall of the basement. I finally succeeded in making an opening big enough to crawl through after what seemed like hours. Just before complete darkness fell, I stepped out into the woodland behind the home. Now, the cabin appeared as it should have abandoned, with a sagging roof and damaged windows. However, shadows travelled over the gaps and lights flashed in those cracked paints. As I dashed across the jungle, I smashed through undergrowth, hoping to find Ezra's pickup. Branches ripped at my face and clothes, but I continued until I came to a road. Ezra wasn't there, but the truck was. It appeared as though he had purposefully left the keys in the ignition. I didn't stop until I got to the gas station where we had met, and I drove that old pickup down the mountain road quicker than was safe. I reported Ezra missing to the sheriff over the phone, and they told me something that chilled me to the bone. In 1987, Ezra Caldwell was reported missing. His body was never found, but his truck had been discovered at the bottom of a ravine. I had spent the day with a man who had passed away more than 30 years ago. My family tree study was never completed. I moved across the country and burned all I had gathered on genealogy. On quiet nights, though, I occasionally still hear that woman's voice calling my name, reminding me that I have family waiting in that void. They are persistent and patient. For good cause, some secrets are kept hidden. Furthermore, the Appalachian mountains are not always a place of tranquil repose for the departed. They await the return of the bloodline. I need others to understand why I'm sharing this experience. Never pay attention to the mountains calling your name. Avoid listening to the whispers. I nearly failed to return, and I still have a piece of myself waiting up there. I'm David, and I was a mountain climber once. I can't gaze at peaks without hearing my name whispered on the wind because of what happened on Grandfather Mountain last spring. Since I was 16 years old, I have been climbing for 23 years. Began on North Carolina's local granite faces, before progressing to more challenging climbs across the Appalachian and beyond. I've climbed mountains in Colorado, Montana, and even made 2 attempts at Denali. However, my first passion has always been the Appalachian Mountains, those old, weathered peaks that speak to something deep within of me and conceal secrets in their shadows. I have always had a spiritual bond with these mountains. Stories of the spirits that resided in the high places and how they occasionally selected particular individuals to join them were shared by my Cherokee grandmother. Them in the everlasting dance between the sky and the earth. Although I never took such tales literally, I could relate to the emotion she was expressing. I sense a connection to something greater than myself while I'm climbing and challenging myself against obstacles like stone, gravity, and my own limitations. It was meant to be a normal climb that would change everything. Technically speaking, Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina is not difficult. It's not so much a climb as a hard hike. However, The majority of visitors never see this part of the north face, a portion of small ledges and exposed rock that needs to be securely navigated using technical skills. I think I've done this route about 50 times over the years. Generally, when I needed to decompress or rekindle my passion for climbing. Location: on a Thursday morning in early May, I set out by myself. It was a flawless weather forecast, light winds, pleasant temperatures, and clear skies. As I've done numerous times previously, I intend to ascend by the tourist trail and then descend the North Face's tough way. Few people ever get to enjoy the breathtaking vistas of the valley that this lovely descent offers. The ascent was an uneventful hike. Around noon, I arrived at the summit after passing a few other hikers on the main trail and exchanging pleasantries. I located a peaceful area because the observation deck was crowded with families and amateur photographers to have lunch and get my equipment ready for the descent. Away from the crowds, I first heard it at that time. My name, David, rang out as loud as day from somewhere outside the tourist zones. Said in a typical conversational volume, not yelled, despite the wind and other guests' conversation. I managed to hear it clearly, though I didn't identify anyone. I glanced around in case someone I knew had noticed me. The voice appeared to be coming from the north face, which is the direction I intended to go down. Come on over, David. Once more, I recognized the soft, familiar voice of a woman, but I was unable to identify it. The voice sounded like my grandmother's, but she had been dead for 15 years. I walked over to the north face's edge and peered down. It was easy to see the technical path I had intended. I'd used a set of rappel spots and ledges thousands of times. I had never seen a tiny track that followed a ridgeline before, but now it appeared that there was another path. It appeared difficult but doable, and it appeared to lead to a part of the mountain I had never been to before. Once more, the voice was more urgent. In this manner, David, I've been anticipating my superior judgment, and ever since, I've regretted this every day. I started to follow the voice rather than my intended path. After setting up my rappel equipment, I began to descend the north face. However, I chose to follow the new ridgeline rather than my typical route. Although I couldn't recall seeing it on any topographical charts, the route appeared to have been well traveled, and the rock felt sturdy underfoot. The voice grew more distinct and clear with each stride. Yes, exactly. Continue to arrive. You're nearly here. My logical side of the brain was shouting warnings. I didn't intend to take this way. I was following a voice that shouldn't have been there, veering off course from a climb I knew by heart. However, there was an allure to the sound that prevented one from turning around. It was like returning home. The new route took me up a slender ridge, had never seen before, providing vistas of the valley that were entirely unlike anything I had seen on this mountain previously, as though I were witnessing the region as it had been centuries ago. The terrain below appeared more untamed and archaic. No buildings, no roads, a forest that goes on forever to the horizon. Look at me, David. I spotted her when I looked up. 100 yards ahead, an old Native American woman in traditional clothing stood on a rocky outcrop. Her eyes seemed to contain depths that spanned generations, and her long grey hair swirled in a breeze I couldn't sense in the old photos. She resembled my grandma completely, but she seemed timeless. I screamed out, "Grandmother," even though I knew it was not possible. With a smile, she gestured for me to keep climbing in her direction. "Grasson, you've kept me waiting a long time. It's time to return home." Every sense I had cultivated over the course of more than 20 years of climbing was telling me to stop, turn around, and leave this mountain right away. However, something more powerful than reason or survival instinct pulled me in with her warm, inviting voice. Strange things started happening to my equipment as I climbed toward her. My GPS device began displaying improbable coordinates. The device indicated that I was ascending a peak that was 3,000 feet higher than the true elevation of Grandfather Mountain. I couldn't detect magnetic north, so my compass whirled crazily. I continued climbing even though it felt like the air itself was getting thicker and harder to breathe. Even though I knew she couldn't be, the woman my grandmother kept pushing me on. "David, just a bit farther. You're nearly there. You're nearly at home." As I got closer, the rocky outcrop where she was standing seemed to get farther away, never quite reaching me. Hours went by, but my watch was no longer functional. There was no movement of the sun in the sky. Time itself seems to be suspended. I became aware that I was no longer on Grandfather Mountain at that point. Unbelievably high above me, the peak I was climbing vanished into clouds that had not existed when I began. Below, the forest appeared older, wilder, and full of trees, from a time before people lived there, and there were scores of other climbers strewn across the mountainside, all moving steadily upward with the same dreamy, determined expression I could sense on my own face. According to my grandmother, "Welcome to the genuine mountain." Her voice was suddenly emanating from within my mind. The space between the realm of the ancestors and the world of the living. "David, you've been called home. This last climb was usually a preparation for your climbing." As I took a closer look at the other climbers, I became increasingly horrified to see that they were all dressed in antiquated gear from the 1980s, 1970s, and even earlier. Some donned climbing equipment that I had only ever seen in old photos. Their expressions were calm and vacant as they moved with mechanical accuracy, never stopping or turning around. "When did they start climbing?" I inquired. "Time doesn't matter here," she said. Seeking a pinnacle that only those who genuinely comprehend what it is to be one with the stone and sky can attain, they ascended the endless mountain. The illusion was finally broken by the logical side of my thinking. My granny wasn't like this. It wasn't real. I might have been dehydrated or suffering from altitude sickness, but I was having some sort of hallucination. Furthermore, I was in grave danger. I scrambled for my satellite gadget, which I always brought on solo climbs, my emergency beacon. I activated the distress signal despite my clumsy fingers, which seemed to be affected by the thin air. As soon as I hit the button, everything was different. With a screech of anger that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself, the woman, who resembled my grandma, let forth, "You are unable to depart. You've been selected. You've been called by the mountain." The other climbers' expressions changed from calm to one of hunger and desperation. As they turned to face me, they started to move more quickly, scurrying across the rocks in my direction at unnatural speed. As quickly as I could, I rappelled down the face. I was so desperate to get out that I forgot appropriate technique. The search and rescue were receiving the beacon's GPS coordinates. However, based on its representation, I was somehow 15 miles from the starting point of the ascent. The woman's voice, which was no longer soft or familiar, could be heard yelling my name behind me. "You are now a part of the mountain, David. You are unable to go away." I was being followed down by the other climbers, who were traveling at an impossible pace across terrain that should have needed careful maneuvering. However, they appeared to become less solid as I went down, more akin to the shadows cast by shifting clouds. I repelled for what seemed like hours, going with my gut instead of a predetermined path, until at last my feet contacted a firm surface. I was at a place I had never seen before, at the foot of Grandfather Mountain. The tourist amenities were gone, and I couldn't see my car. I could hear helicopter rotors in the distance, and the search and rescue crew had received the emergency beacon signal 12 miles from where I had left my car. I was sitting next to a road that didn't match their charts when they discovered me 3 hours later. During the search, the rescue team reported that they had lost my beacon signal several times, as, though I had been traveling between areas more quickly than was prudent, I was unable to explain my path when they asked me to. There was no map showing the ridge line I had followed, the impossible to reach peak, or the other climbers. or a shot taken from above. All of my backup equipment was still in my car when they discovered it in the parking lot where I had parked it. My emergency beacon activation timestamp indicated that I had been absent for 7 hours. However, I couldn't recall how I arrived to the spot where they discovered me from the summit. Every test imaginable was performed by the hospital's doctors. Brain scans for stroke or seizure symptoms, blood testing for toxins, and psychological tests for indicators of detachment from reality. Everything returned to normal. I was all right physically. Their examinations showed that I was mentally stable and lucid. However, I am aware of what I went through on that mountain, and I am certain that it was not a delusion. After that day, I sold all of my equipment, cancelled planned adventures, stopped climbing, and turned down requests to join climbing groups. My pals believe that I'm experiencing a midlife crisis of some sort. The reality, however, is more straightforward and frightening. The sound of the mountain calling my name is still audible. All of them, not just Grandfather Mountain. I can see every peak on the horizon. From the window of my apartment, I can see every summit. On calm evenings, they whisper my name, as if the never-ending ascent is still ahead. That I still have a spot allocated among the shadow climbers. I've relocated to the city, but I'm aware that it won't be long. It's impossible to leave the Appalachian mountains, and I'll hear that voice once more someday, warm, comforting, and alluring. It calls me home to a peak that lives outside of time and maps, where climbers rise indefinitely in pursuit of an unreachable goal. The mountains are waiting. They are aware of my return. Additionally, a portion of myself that's already there, waiting, the portion that felt most alive while I was pushing myself against the sky and stone. I need someone to believe me, so I'm sharing this story. 3 months ago, I drove down a road that shouldn't have been, and I'm not sure whether I ever made it back. Now, the same thing appears on every GPS in the town. There used to be a forest along this road, but I know the truth about what's actually down there. I've been driving these mountain roads for 20 years, and my name is Jake Morrison. I doubt I'll ever drive alone again to what transpired on West Virginia's Route 19. Since I was 22, I have been a long-haul truck driver, continuing the tradition started by my father and his father. The Morrisons have been transporting cargo through 3 generations in the Appalachian Mountains. Additionally, we are more familiar with these routes than most individuals are with their own communities. Like a personal GPS system, I have a mental map of every turn, grade, and truck stop from Virginia to Alabama. I'm proud of that information. I can tell you how to travel from point A to point B without ever looking at a screen, whereas other drivers rely on their electronic route planners and satellite navigation. I am aware of which routes have low bridges, which can accommodate a fully loaded rig, and which become muddy nightmares in the event of rain. For me, it's more than just a job. Generations of mountain truckers have mastered this technique. I was moving a bunch of furniture from a North Carolina manufacturing to a Columbus, Ohio warehouse the night everything changed. I had probably run that route 50 times before, usually following Interstate 77 north into West Virginia before branching off onto other roads. Despite being 3 hours behind schedule because of a delay at the factory, I was making good time and the load wasn't that heavy. I knew I had a hard night ahead of me when I arrived in West Virginia just after midnight. After pushing through to a truck stop outside Charleston, I intended to get a few hours of sleep before completing the run to Columbus the next morning. I had my CB radio set to channel 19, listening to the sporadic chatter, and the roads were deserted save for the occasional passing car of other drivers at night. At that point, my GPS unit, a high-end device I had purchased the previous year, suggested something I had never seen in my 20 years of driving these mountains. The automated voice said, "Turn right for an alternate route in 2 miles. You will save 37 minutes and 42 miles by using this route. I frowned as I looked at the screen. The recommended path revealed a road that went straight through what I believed to be uncrossable mountainous terrain. The display indicated that this unidentified road would go straight past Charleston and join my intended path close to the Ohio border. I mumbled, "That's impossible," but I was intrigued. I've been driving for 20 years, yet I've never seen this road on an electronic or paper map. I had never heard of the Route 19L2 designation, but the GPS insisted it was it. I took out my old paper atlas, which my father had given me when I first learned to drive, as a test. There were no roads, no cities, just wilderness, and just contour lines suggesting steep, undeveloped mountains in the area where the GPS indicated the alternate route. However, 37 minutes could make the difference between my making my delivery on time and getting fined for being late, and 42 miles was 42 miles. I chose to look into it against my better judgment. The GPS predicted that the turnoff would emerge precisely where it did. A green highway sign that reads Route 19, Columbus, 127 miles, indicates a perfectly paved road that branches off to the right. There were no orange cones, construction signs, or other indicators of recent road work, but the pavement appeared new, as if it had been laid within the last 12 months. The first thing that caught my attention was the total lack of traffic. Other drivers ought to have been using this road if it had actually saved 40 miles on a key trucking route. However, I didn't see any headlights in my mirrors or a single pair of taillights in front of me as I turned the corner and began traveling on the new route. The route was expertly designed, with gradients that never went over what a fully laden vehicle could manage and soft curves that mirrored the mountain's natural shapes. In comfort, trucking was understood by whoever constructed this highway. The sight lines were flawless. There were even sporadic pull-offs for slower cars, and the shoulders were sufficiently broad for emergency stops. However, there was a problem. With the terrain, I began passing things that didn't make sense as I continued to drive deeper into the mountains. The skeletal remains of a tipple where coal would have been loaded onto trucks, some abandoned rail cars, a rusting conveyor line, and outdated mining equipment were all that was visible at first. In West Virginia, that wasn't unusual. Relics from the coal industry are scattered throughout the highlands. The state of some of the equipment was out of the ordinary. Amidst the visibly ancient and corroded equipment were some that appeared considerably more recent, modern excavators, bright yellow bulldozers, and even some items with brand new manufacturer tags. It appeared as though mining activities from several decades had been abandoned at various points in time in the same spot. About mile 15 is when my CB radio began to malfunction. I was picking up bits and pieces of conversations that seemed like they were from a different era. Rather than the typical late-night trucker banter, I heard scratchy, distorted voices talking about shift patterns and coal pricing in terms I hadn't heard since my grandfather's tales of mine work in the 1950s. Shaft number 4 is producing well. Through the static, one voice could be heard, crackling. Morrison should be told to get his boys ready for the early shift. My name is Morrison, although my ancestors were truckers rather than miners, and it sounded as though the voice was from decades ago. I became aware that the mile signs were counting down rather than up at that point. Mile markers on the majority of roadways were numbered consecutively from a starting point. Miles 1, 2, 3, and so forth. However, the Route 19 out markers were counting backwards, miles 47, 46, and 45, as if I were moving toward a destination rather than away from a starting point. By mile 30, the inaccuracy of it was getting hard to ignore the problem. I was traveling through what should have been insurmountable mountains on the road. However, the scenery outside my windows didn't like any West Virginian terrain was familiar with. The radio chatter was becoming more distinct. The ridge lines were incorrect. The valleys were too deep, and the forests were too thick and undeveloped. A dispatcher's voice declared urgently, "Cave in at the Morrison site. Every unit reacts. Men are trapped here." "How many?" a different voice inquired. "There are 12 men working nights. The team of Jake Morrison." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "My name's Jake Morrison." However, I had never had a crew or worked in a mine. The voices were discussing things that couldn't possibly happen and about non-existent persons. I noticed the lights up ahead at that point. I initially believed it to be another truck. But when I drew nearer, I saw that it was considerably stranger, dispersed throughout a valley. Dozens of lights, the type of industrial lighting found at a busy mining operation, were visible to my left. I could see the silhouettes of workers moving about the site. Conveyor belts were in motion, and machinery was in operation. However, every map I was aware of indicated that there shouldn't be any active mining in this region. When the coal played out years ago, the majority of operations in this region of West Virginia had been discontinued. At this point, the road started to bend downhill, going down into the valley where the mining facility was situated. I could tell that the mining site was where Route 19 also terminated. There was no way to go on toward Columbus, no through traffic. The road ended abruptly at a sizable parking lot crowded with pickup trucks and other work vehicles from various historical periods. A few of the cars appeared to be recent, last week. Late model Chevy Silverados and Ford F-150s might have been driven off dealer lots. Others were clearly older trucks from the 1980s, with fading paint and corrosion. Vehicles from the 1970s that had designs I recognized from my early years. Vehicles that appeared to belong in a museum were also strewn about. Work trucks from the 1950s, and even older models that I was unable to recognize. Looking at 70 years of mining history parked in one lot was like that. My truck's brakes weren't working correctly as it rolled into the parking lot because I couldn't figure out how to stop it. The miners were visible to me. They were finishing their shift as they made their way from the mine entrance to the parking lot, passing the weary, sluggish gait of guys who had been underground for 8 hours. Some wore brand new steel-toed boots, reflective vests, hard hats with LED lights, and other contemporary safety gear. Others donned the vintage gear I'd seen in old photographs. Some of them resembled people from my family's old photos, with carbide torches, plain canvas clothes, and leather boots that had aged smoothly. Directly approaching my truck was a tall, thin man with my father's face, dressed in mining gear from the 1960s. Others followed, men with the features of the Morrison family, each dressed for a different mining era. My grandfather passed away when I was 12. I had only ever seen old photos of my great-grandfather, and a man who looked just like me stood in the middle of the group, wearing a hard hat with the word foreman stenciled on the front. He walked over to my cab's driver's side and signaled for me to down the window. He spoke in a voice just like mine when I did. "I'm not a miner," I answered, even if my voice sounded unsure. "You're late for your shift, Jake. The night crew's been waiting. I work as a truck driver. I'm only attempting to reach Columbus." It felt like he was gazing into a mirror when he grinned. "Son, Morrison men aren't truck drivers. We are mine workers, always will, always have. Your crews are waiting in shaft number 4. Now the other miners were gathered around my truck, their faces expectant and patient as they looked up at me. I recognized a few from family pictures. Others appeared to be family, even though they were strangers. The instruments of their work were worn by all of them, safety gear from many decades, including lunch pails, shovels, and pickaxes. My grandfather's voice yelled, "Jake, it's time to come home and join the family business." I could feel myself being drawn into their rhythm, their expectations, and I wanted to climb down from the supernatural highway that had been gathering Morrison men for generations and dragging them away from their real lives and into an endless mining shift that lasted decades. That's when I realized what Route 19 out really was. It wasn't a shortcut to Columbus, but rather a trap. The logical part of my mind was screaming warnings, but I fumbled for my emergency kit, the roadside safety gear that all professional truckers carry, and found the emergency flares, the bright red highway flares that warn other drivers of disabled vehicles. I popped the cap on the first flare, and it burst into brilliant red light. The miners retreated, shielding their eyes, and their solid appearance started to waver like heat mirages. "He's not ready," one of them yelled. "Let him go. He will return." I threw 2 more flares out the window after lighting them. Whatever magic was keeping my truck in the parking lot appeared to be broken by the harsh chemical light. Under my control, the engine that had been running but unresponsive abruptly surged back to life. As quickly as I could, I backed out of the parking lot and put the truck in reverse. I could see the miners watching me go in my side mirrors, their faces sad but unsurprised. In what could have been a promise or a farewell, the 4 men who resembled me raised their hands. I backed off up the slope, and the mining activity dwindled. The workers slipped back into the darkness as the lights went out and the machinery became quiet. Nothing but barren woodland occupied the valley by the time I reached the summit of the ridge. Route 19. Out had vanished. I was back on Interstate 77, which is the normal highway I should have been on the entire time. My GPS said that I was in the precise location I would have been had I not taken the detour. However, my clock indicated that I had lost 4 hours in those mountains. I arrived in Columbus 12 hours late, and I had no way to justify it to my dispatcher without subjecting him to a psychological assessment and drug test. Here's what still keeps me up at night, though. Since then, every GPS device I've looked at displays Route 19 out as an actual road. The new route through West Virginia, which saves time on Columbus runs, is mentioned by truckers I spoke to at stops. A few of them never reach their final destinations. Morrison men, and perhaps others whose families have a long history in the Appalachian mining sector, are still being picked up by the road. It continues to provide drivers who are unaware of their family background time savings and shortcuts. Additionally, I occasionally hear them calling on the CB radio late at night when I'm driving by myself. "Your shift begins in an hour, Jake Morrison. It's time to return home and work at the family business." Every family that has ever delved into the mountain's depths is remembered by them. Additionally, they never let their employees to fully retire. After 15 years of trail maintenance in these mountains, I believed I understood every route, risk, and danger. However, I learned in October of last year that some routes are self-maintained and do not desire human intervention. My name is Tom Bradley, and I am aware that people are merely visitors to these old mountains, and some visitors remain too long. Given what transpired on Virginia's Section 12 of the Appalachian Trail, since 2009, I have volunteered to maintain a 20-mile stretch of the Appalachian Trail across central Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains on behalf of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. I enjoy working alone, yet it's isolated. Maintaining these trails accessible and secure for the thousands of hikers who use them every year brings a great sense of fulfillment. Along my designated stretch, I am familiar with every rock, every path, and every view. I've fixed broken bridges, constructed water bars to stop erosion, removed fallen trees following storms, and replaced innumerable fires. Although it is necessary, trail maintenance is not a glamorous job. In just a few seasons, these paths would be overgrown and hazardous if they weren't regularly maintained. It's my responsibility to preserve the delicate balance between access and preservation, because nature has a way of reclaiming what people have carved out of the environment. This specific maintenance trip was planned following a powerful storm that hit central Virginia in October. Significant damage had been reported to the Trail Conservancy along a number of sections, including at least one bridge that had been swept out by rapid flooding, fallen trees obstructing the path, and damaged blazes. I was tasked with evaluating and fixing a 5-meter section that had apparently been struck severely. It was a clear Saturday morning as I drove up to the trailhead. My pickup vehicle was full with goods for what I anticipated to be a long weekend of work, including tools, paint for reviving fires, and lumber for repairing bridges. I had intended to camp at specific locations along the path instead of making the daily journey back and forth, because the damage reports had been so widespread. However, I discovered an impossibility when I arrived at the first damage site that had been recorded. The path was flawless, not just livable, but spotless. The route was free of trash. The fires were new and luminous. Not only was the ostensibly damaged bridge still standing, it appeared to have been built recently. There was no discoloration on the wood. The whole thing looked like it had been constructed in the last week, and the bolts were shining. For a few minutes, I stood there looking at my maintenance maps and GPS data. Undoubtedly, this was the ideal spot. The trail exhibited no traces of recent storm damage, but I had worked this section for years and knew all the landmarks. I discovered the same thing when I hiked on to inspect the other areas where damage had been recorded. All the downed trees had been removed, each part that had been wiped out had been restored, and new fires had mathematically indicated the path. I had been beaten to the maintenance task, however, strict timetables and procedures are followed by the Path Conservancy. I would have been informed if my part had been assigned to another volunteer. Professional maintenance crews never operate without coordination, and the level of expertise and scope of the work I observed was too high to be the product of well-intentioned hikers tidying up after themselves. I became aware of the tools at that point. I discovered a whole set of trail maintenance tools, perfectly aligned next to the path at the third repair location. Paintbrushes, brush cutters, pruning shears, and measuring instruments are all arranged with military accuracy. Some of the instruments had designs I had never seen before, and they were old but in perfect condition. Vintage equipment that displayed no evidence of age or damage, yet appeared to have been manufactured decades ago. I thought there could be another maintenance working nearby, so I shouted out, "Hi there, is there anyone present? Are these your instruments?" My shout bounced off the nearby peaks, but nobody answered. It was hauntingly silent in the jungle. There was an eerie quiet that made me very conscious of every sound. I was making no bird sounds, no tiny animal scurrying, no wind rustling through the trees. I took pictures of the enigmatic instruments and their exact placement, but I chose to proceed with my planned maintenance check. The tableau seemed purposefully constructed, as if it were a message I was meant to comprehend. I started to notice further irregularities as I traveled farther into my designated region. There were blazes where I hadn't planned for upkeep. Trees with no blazes should have perfect white rectangles painted on them. Others led off the designated path in the direction of what looked like detours I had never seen before. The footprints were the most unsettling. I discovered bootprints in muddy areas of the route that came and went in an erratic way. In the middle of a journey, a clear set of prints would abruptly stop, as though the person who made them had just disappeared, as though someone had suddenly appeared in the center of the path. More tracks appeared out of nowhere. A single person was suggested by the print's uniform tread pattern and size. However, the steps weren't spaced correctly. Sometimes they are too close together, and other times they are too far away, as though the individual creating them didn't move in the typical ways that people do. By the end of the afternoon, I was thinking about calling off the maintenance trip. I had 15 years of outdoor expertise, and everything about the situation felt wrong. However, I still had valid maintenance chores to finish after traveling 4 hours to get here. About 10 miles into the route, I camped at a designated location. I made an effort to persuade myself that all I had seen could be explained logically as night fell. It's possible that another volunteer misunderstood the duties. It's possible that some of the damage reports were inaccurately localized or overstated. However, I heard them working at midnight. The woodland reverberated with the sounds of trail maintenance, the steady thud of wood being chopped, the sound of instruments rubbing against rock, the sound of brush being raked out, as though a whole team was laboring across the forest. The noises emanated from all sides. I picked up my headlamp and made my way to the closest noises, but everything fell silent as soon as I left my campground. I scanned the woodland around me with my laser beam, but all I could see were trees and shadows. My own tools had been moved when I got back to camp. They were set up in, as though someone were pointing. The exact line I had previously found was spread out next to my tent. When I awoke the following morning, I saw that my trail segment had changed during the night. I had never seen routes marked by new blazes, intricate wooden bridges cross gullies that had not been there the day before. Steep parts of stone steps had been mathematically precisely cut. The piece was stunning yet unachievable. The sort of construction that would require weeks to finish with a professional staff. All of this brought trekkers to uncharted territory in the deep forest, away from the well-traveled Appalachian trail. I was standing there looking at one of the new bridges. Behind me, I heard a voice. "This is not where you should be." I turned and was confronted by something that was obviously no longer human, but might have been in the past. It was slender and tall, and its clothing appeared to have been made of materials I didn't identify, but had been intended for trail labor. Its eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, and its grey, aged skin looked like ancient bark. "This is my section," I murmured, struggling to maintain a steady tone. "These paths have been under my care for 15 years. It cocked its head, examining me with what may have been interest. "These trails predate your species. Before your ancestors ever considered crossing the ocean, they were molded by creatures who were familiar with the mountains. We keep them up for reasons you can't comprehend. A public resource is the Appalachian Trail. People rely on appropriate upkeep for their safety," I remarked. With a sound akin to wind through parched leaves, the thing chuckled. "Where we let them walk, your people walk. What we decide to show them is what they see. The actual paths that go through these mountains are not the same as the ones you believe you keep up." It pointed to the bridges and fires that had sprung up throughout the night. "These went to locations that aren't shown on your maps, locations where time passes in a different way, where the mountains recall their former selves before being harmed by your civilization." I answered, "I just want to do my job. I wish to protect the trail." "Then demonstrate that you comprehend the true meaning of that." It was an easy yet daunting challenge. In order to prove that I could labor with respect for whatever intelligence controlled these mountains, I had to spend 3 days and nights pursuing the entity's fresh blazes, keeping up the enigmatic paths that led into uncharted territory, parts of the Appalachian that are not shown on any topographical survey were shown to me by the routes I traveled over those 3 days. I tended bridges over impossibly deep canyons, plowed trails through woods where the trees predated European habitation, and rekindled fires that denoted pathways to locations that seemed to exist beyond everyday reality. As it observed me at work, it assessed my technique, my awareness of the environment, and my comprehension that I was a visitor to something far older and more vast than human civilization. It spoke to me again on the 3rd night as I was camping, next to an uphill flowing brook that reflected stars I didn't identify. "You are free to carry on working, but please remember that you are working with our consent and not by default. When the mountains approve of your aims, they will direct your efforts." The enigmatic paths had disappeared by the time I hiked back to my pickup. Although it wasn't flawless, my portion of the Appalachian Trail appeared to be well maintained and in fantastic condition. My truck had my tools back in the identical configuration I had packed. Although I still keep up the trails in these mountains, I now get permission before doing so. Before I start working, I whisper to the trees what I intend to do and why. Sometimes, when the mountains approve of my efforts, maintenance chores finish themselves overnight. On other occasions, I found that repairs I had done had been quietly changed for reasons I don't completely get. Now that the mountains are watching me work, I realize that I'm only there because they let me. I've discovered that maintaining trails isn't about forcing our will on the wilderness. Hopefully, our modest efforts to maintain these routes will be in line with whatever higher purpose leads the ancient roads through the heart of Appalachia. It's about negotiating with intellect that is far older and wiser than our species. The best we can do is uphold certain routes with humility and respect, because they were forged by forces beyond our comprehension. For 3 summers, I stood guard over thousands of acres as a fire lookout from a tower that was meant to be abandoned. However, I wasn't alone up there, and my dreams are constantly plagued by what I saw through those binoculars. Chris is my name. I can't let another college student make the same mistake I did, so Morgan and I must share this tale since I've seen job advertisements for the identical fire tower position. At the age of 21, I was in dire need of a summer job that would pay enough to pay for my tuition for my senior year, when I happened onto a job posting on the University Employment Board that looked too good to be true. The majority of my acquaintances were earning slightly above minimum wage in retail or restaurant jobs. Throughout the Appalachian Mountains, the North Carolina Forest Service was recruiting fire lookouts for isolated towers, paying them twice as much as summer labor. That job was just what I needed. Good income, the kind of serenity that appealed to someone who had spent 3 years putting up with noisy housemates and congested dorms. An isolated job that would allow me to study during calm times. I'd always been at ease by myself, assured of my capacity to manage crises, and the task it sounded like paid camping with obligations based on the description. The interview was short and very informal. Henderson, a seasoned Forest Service supervisor, was more concerned in my psychological makeup than my credentials. He kept asking if I had any expertise with radio equipment, if I was at ease in solitude, and if I had ever seen strange things in the bush. He clarified that some of our towers are situated in really remote areas. Lookouts may not see another person for weeks at a time. Some people are more affected by the seclusion than others. Someone who can manage the psychological strain is what we need. He put me in charge of T-Tower 47, which was a 4-hour trek up a peak in the Pisgah National Forest. Constructed in the 1940s, the tower was formally retired in 1987 as aircraft surveillance outperformed human observation. Henderson clarified, however, that in order to save money, they had to reactivate a number of distant towers due to recent budget cuts. Although exhausting, the trek to Tower 47 was breathtaking. As I climbed higher, the route switched backed up into ever steeper terrain and through various habitats. I was excited yet fatigued by the time I arrived at the tower. It was a traditional fire lookout building, a little cabin with windows on all sides that provides sweeping views of the surrounding woods, set on steel legs around 60 feet above the forest floor. However, there was something that unnerved me as I ascended the steps to the cabin. The items from the prior lookout were still there. Food, clothing, and personal belongings are all kept in the little refrigerator. On the desk next to the radio was a coffee mug, half full of a long old, moldy liquid. According to the logbook, the most recent entry was made on August 15, 1987. Day 73. Sector 7 has strange lights once more. Sending a dispatch report. The weather is clear, and visibility is good. There is undoubtedly something out there. Mayor Patterson, 3 days prior to the tower's purported decommissioning. That entry was dated. When I attempted to inquire my supervisor about the prior lookout's possessions over the radio, I received an odd reaction. It wasn't Henderson's voice answering. I couldn't identify the woman's accent. She also didn't appear to understand which tower I was phoning from. Tower 47. Honey, it has been closed for decades. Are you certain that you are reading your coordinates correctly? She put me on hold when I insisted I was in Tower 47 and had been formally assigned there. Henderson's voice broke through the static after a few minutes. Please disregard the earlier lookout material. Patterson had a peculiar personality. Keep your attention on your work and report any fire activity you come across. The first week went off without any problems. I developed a pattern. Morning weather checks, hourly binocular forest scans, dispatch radio check-ins, and evening reports. During quiet times, I took advantage of the amazing tranquility of being alone above the forest canopy and studied for my forthcoming senior year. However, I saw things that didn't make sense via the binoculars. I would see movement that appeared to be humans strolling through the forest in areas without roads, trails, or human access. They traveled at speeds that seemed unthinkable for humans on foot, and they moved in straight lines, disregarding the terrain's natural contours. They would just disappear as if they had never been there, even when I tried to follow them with the binoculars. Even more unsettling were the radio chats. I occasionally heard other voices interrupting my regular check-ins with dispatch. Lookouts in the past have reported from towers that had been destroyed years prior. As though they were still on duty, they described the weather and fire activity in cool, professional tones. Tower 23 will be sent out. 8 miles in the distance, 15 knots of wind from the southwest. Sector 12 is experiencing unusual fire activity, although it is not spreading normally. Against the wind, the flames are going upward. Reporting from Tower 8, day 127 of non-stop work. There is still no scheduled relief. The woodland observers are approaching the base of the tower. Ask for a backup right now. Henderson told me was picking up old records when I questioned him about these transmissions. The chats were too immediate and engaged to be recorded. However, there was some sort of radio echo effect that is typical in mountainous areas. I found a secret room on the 10th day I was in the tower. There was a small entrance in the main cabin behind a bookcase that I had somehow overlooked on my first inspection. Decades of surveillance gear, cameras with enormous telescopic lenses, recording devices, and hundreds of photos capturing things that shouldn't have been there were all in the room beyond. The images displayed, in far more detail, the identical figures I had been viewing via binoculars. Tall, slender creatures that walked with an unnatural grace through the jungle, 4 hours at a time. Some stood still at the edge of the woodland, seemingly observing the tower itself. One picture chilled me to the bone. It displayed the interior of Tower 47 as seen through the windows of the cabin. One of the tall figures was standing next to me in the picture, looking over my bed as though observing me, as I was sleeping in the tiny cot. 2 nights prior, the picture was dated. That's when I realized Tower 47 had never been shut down. It was now used as an observation point to keep tabs on any paranormal activity in the area. No fires were being monitored by the Forest Service. They were keeping an eye out for something quite different. As I looked at the pictures, the radio sounded. However, it wasn't dispatch or another lookout who spoke this time. Something else was involved. Something that had been hearing everything I sent. Lookout Morgan, good evening. You have been observing us. It is time for us to talk. One of the towering figures was standing in the doorway of the secret room when I turned around. It was clearly not human up close. It was out of proportion. Too tall, slender, and having joints that twisted in ways that were contrary to anatomy. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's, and its face was a smooth expanse of grey skin, with a voice that seemed to come from inside my head rather than my ears. It stated, "You're doing the same job as your predecessors, observing the forest, making notes, and reporting irregularities. The only distinction is that you're still unsure of what you're actually seeing." I retreated to the main cabin and remarked, "I'm just a college student. My stay here is limited to the summer." Patterson also believed he was merely performing his Duties. He was preceded by Thompson and Richardson. The truth was revealed to them all. The tower's ultimate purpose is to keep an eye on the line separating your world from ours. The watchers must be watched by someone. It pointed to the surveillance apparatus. We live in multiple dimensions. Although your species only perceives 3, the location of the tower makes it possible to see dimensional intrusions that pose a threat to both of our realms. The prior lookouts were aware of their true mission. They decided to remain. What became of them? They are still present, continuing to observe and report. The work never stops. Morgan, take heed. Permanent observers who know what they're actually viewing are needed on the mountains. Voices could now be heard over the radio. They were everywhere, checking in from towers in dimensions I couldn't see. In the past, lookouts reported on weather patterns that occurred in the gaps between thoughts, beasts that roamed through forests of probability, and fires that burnt in the space between worlds. The entity went on. You can join them. Alternatively, you can depart and live your entire life with the knowledge that the border is unprotected, that encroachments will go unnoticed, and that your world will gradually merge with ours until the difference is irrelevant. I considered my typical life, my final year of college, and my future goals, but I also considered the responsibility I had unwittingly taken on when I accepted this position. Abandoning the tower may have unimaginable repercussions if it was indeed monitoring threats to both worlds. I recalled my emergency procedures training at that point. For life-threatening emergencies, each lookout is equipped with a satellite beacon. When I turned mine on, I sent a distress signal to the Forest Service headquarters, but I couldn't get a response. The rescue crew said they were unable to find Tower 47. There was no such tower in the Pisa National Forest. Based on their data, I gave coordinates, but all I saw was barren wasteland. The thing may have been amused as it observed me. The tower is interdimensional. Morgan, take heed. There is just one in which your rescue crew works. Unless you decide to go back to their reality, they can't get to you. I stay in my current place for 3 days, filing reports and keeping an eye on the forest while attempting to figure out how to get out of the interdimensional trap I fell into. I wasn't threatened by the creature, but it made it apparent that leaving would mean quitting my post and maybe putting both universes in risk that I couldn't understand. Something changed during a brief thunderstorm on the 4th day. The tower appeared to be brought back to normalcy by the lightning. For a few minutes, I was able to see the forest as it truly was, free of the false topography, the watchers, and the dimensional overlays. Rappelling down the outside of the tower as quickly as I could, I snatched up my rucksack and headed for the steps. I could hear the voice of every prior lookout who had stayed behind me, as well as the things shouting my name, just as the storm passed and the tower started to revert to its interdimensional condition. I arrived at the trail. Without turning around, I dashed down the mountain. Continuing till I arrived at the trailhead at my car, I discovered that Tower 47 had been deleted from all official documents when I attempted to report what had occurred. The Forest Service was unaware of any reactivated fire towers in the area, had no proof of my employment, and no record of my position. Although I never went on another fire lookout duty, I occasionally still hear radio calls from previous lookouts checking in, reporting fires that burn in dimensions that are invisible to us, and keeping an eye out for incursions that could jeopardize the boundary between realms. Someone must keep watch since the mountains are always watching. However, I made the decision to just exist in one dimension, even if it meant not finishing the task. Some towers are intended to remain abandoned, and some responsibilities are too much for a college student to handle. Think twice before applying if you discover a job posting for a fire lookout that pays too much and requires too little experience. Though they prefer those who never ask to return home, the mountains need guards. I'm telling this tale because I want people to know that, regardless of how experienced you believe you are, some underground locations should never be investigated. I entered a system of caves in eastern Kentucky 6 months ago that isn't listed on any geological surveys. Furthermore, I'm still unsure if I ever return to the surface. I'm Rebecca Martinez, and I was a professional spelunker once. Used to be because I can't gaze at cave entrances without hearing voices calling from the darkness below, especially after what I discovered in the depths of the Daniel Boone National Forest. Since I first learned about cave exploration in graduate school, while studying geology, I have been doing it for 12 years. Navigating underground passageways and being the first person to witness structures that have been growing in darkness for millions of years may be quite satisfying. Throughout the southeast, I have investigated cave systems, from the technical difficulties of Alabama's deepest holes to the enormous chambers of Mammoth Cave. I have a cave rescue certification. I never cave by myself, and I always have the right gear. The regulations that keep spelunkers alive are those. However, I disregarded my own rules this time. While researching the geology of automobiles for my PhD dissertation in Kentucky, I learned about the cave system from Jimmy Caldwell, a local. I had been doing interviews with long-time locals regarding the historical use of caverns, including how they were utilized by past generations for refuge, storage, and occasionally illegal purposes during the Prohibition era. Jimmy was in his 80s, incredibly smart, and more knowledgeable about the subsurface geography of the area than anyone I had ever encountered. He informed me over coffee at a Hazard restaurant that there's a cave system up on Bent Creek Ridge that ain't on any of your maps. He explained that a cave entrance concealed behind a waterfall was only open during dry seasons when the water level dropped. My daddy showed it to me when I was a boy, but I ain't been back since. Something about that place just ain't right. With tubes linking to other cave networks around the area, the entry opened into a vast chamber system that stretched 4 miles beneath. However, Jimmy's description was ambiguous, apparently on purpose, as though he didn't want to give too much information. Why does it not have a map? I inquired. A system of that size ought to have extensive documentation. Jimmy's face grew serious. Miss, there are some things that are better left alone. When his grandfather was a boy, my father informed me the cave was old, claimed that although things went there to die, they occasionally don't stay dead. I ought to have followed his advice, but I was too ecstatic about the prospect of finding an uncharted cave system. The academic ramifications for my research were significant, because discovering virgin root is the ultimate goal in spelunking. Jimmy declined to personally lead me to the door, but I persuaded him to give me directions, following game trails and creek beds through uninhabited country. The climb to Bent Creek Ridge took the better part of a morning. Jimmy had accurately identified the location of the waterfall, a 40-foot waterfall that plunged into a deep pool encircled by limestone cliffs. However, the cave entrance was totally submerged due to the high water level. I camped nearby and waited 2 weeks for a dry spell to bring the water level down. While I waited, recording the surface geology, the cave entrance, a shadowy aperture behind the falls that was perhaps 6 feet high and 4 feet broad, was visible to me when the torrent eventually slowed to a trickle. I chose to conduct my first reconnaissance alone, defying every safety precaution I had ever been taught. I promised myself that I would only examine the entrance and perhaps go around the first room to see if it was worth sending a complete team. I was well equipped with emergency communications equipment, many light sources, and technical gear. What might go wrong? After about 50 feet of a low crawl, the entrance passage opened onto a chamber that left me speechless. There was more room than most of the recorded caves in the area, as my headlamp beam vanished into the blackness above and to either side. The floor was smooth limestone carved by ancient water flow, and the walls were covered in flow stone formations that glistened in my light like crystals, but the silence was what caught my attention right away. The sounds of dripping water, bat wings flapping, faint creaks, and the moans of moving rock typically heard in cave systems. It was as though the ground itself was holding its breath, since this cave was so quiet. After setting up my equipment, I started taking measurements and photos of the chamber. The area had root openings that led off in several directions and was essentially round, having a circumference of 200 feet. Some were spacious enough for comfortable walking. Others were claustrophobic, requiring crawling. When I saw the bones strewn all over the chamber floor, I realized they were skeletal remains. In addition to animal bones, the remains of deer, bears, and other woodland animals were combined with human skulls and femurs. The bones were old, whitened by mineral deposits and time, yet their patterns indicated intentional placement rather than organic accumulation. I heard the first voice as I was taking pictures of a really enormous arrangement from somewhere farther down the tunnel system. I heard my name, Rebecca, sounded clearly. It was a female voice. I couldn't place it, but it seemed familiar. I yelled back, but my voice reverberated oddly across the enormous room, as if it were multiplying and warping before vanishing into quiet. Go deeper, Rebecca. We've been holding out. I recognized the voice this time. 3 years prior, my sister Maria had lost her life in an automobile accident. However, that was not feasible. The caver had never been Maria, hadn't even been to Kentucky. I made an effort to persuade myself that it was an auditory phenomenon. Perhaps sounds that approximated human speech were produced by wind flowing through the tunnels. However, the voices grew more frequent and distinct as I explored further. From a corridor to my left, my graduate advisor, Dr. Peterson, called my name. From someplace above, my childhood buddy Sarah whispered encouragement. Even my grandma, who passed away when I was 12, encouraged me to keep exploring in order to discover what might be hidden in the most obscure passageways. They were all people whose voices I would know anywhere, people I had lost, and people I had grieved for. I ought to have gone back. Each and every 12-year-old caver's instinct was screaming warnings. However, the voices were incredibly kind and inviting, and they were leading me to findings that would completely transform the field of cave science. I used the voices to guide me as I followed the longest section farther into the system. My depth gauge indicated that I was sinking well below the water table as the path slanted progressively downhill. Around me, the structures grew more intricate. I had never seen crystal formations, massive stalactites, or cascades of flowstones. I finally made it into a room that defied geological explanation after what seemed like hours of travel. The area was enormous, perhaps the size of a football stadium, with a ceiling that was obscured by the darkness. The light source, however, was the impossibility. The walls themselves emitted a gentle phosphorescent glow that was sufficiently bright to look through without my illumination. Dozens of individuals were seated in meditation positions on the polished limestone floor of the hall. The clothes they wore were from different times. While some were dressed in decades-old clothing, others were wearing hiking gear from today. Some were dressed in such antiquated attire that they resembled historical museum costumes. As I walked in, I noticed a mix of familiar faces and unfamiliar ones, and they all turned to stare at me. Maria was present, seeming just as she had prior to the mishap. Beside her, Dr. Peterson was dressed in the identical field gear he had worn when he perished in a cave-in 2 years prior. From the other side of the room, my grandma, unaffected by the years since her passing, grinned at me. After standing and approaching me, Maria remarked, "Welcome home, Rebecca. You've been looking for us for a very long time." I backed toward the passage door and murmured, "This isn't real. You're dead. All of you are dead. Death is my grandmother." Remark softly, "Just another passage, like the caves you love to explore. The last room, where all the passages meet, is the deepest chamber, which we discovered. The cave system is older than human civilization, Rebecca. It's been gathering explorers for millennia. Everyone who truly loves the underground eventually finds their way here. Dr. Peterson stood and walked toward me, his face kind but alien. As I glanced around the room, I noticed that some of the seated figures weren't human at all. "You can stay," Maria said, taking my hand. "No more loneliness, no more searching, just the eternal exploration of passages that exist between life and death." They were older, more primitive, and had bone structures that suggested they had been here before modern humans evolved. They were ancient cave explorers from species that had disappeared from the surface world. I had never felt anything like the warmth of her touch since she passed away. There was an irresistible need to stay and join the never-ending group of adventurers. However, my apparatus continued to function, continued to capture information, and continue to be connected to the outside world. If I didn't return on time, my emergency beacon would send GPS locations to cave rescue teams, who would then come look for me. I sprinted toward the passage entrance after turning on my emergency locator. Behind me, a chorus of voices rose, not indignant but dissatisfied that I had chosen the solitude of the surface over the camaraderie of the depths. I had lost the tunnel that had led me to the chamber. Dozens of I followed the lifeline I had set up on my way down, my rappelling rope. However, the rope took me into rooms that defied the local geology and to passageways I had never seen before. In the gloom, time moved in an odd way. I had been below for 3 hours, according to my watch, but it felt like days. I was tired and confused when I finally noticed a natural light up ahead. Desperate to find the entryway behind the waterfall, I crawled toward it. Instead, miles away from where I had entered, in a valley I didn't recognize, I came out of a cave mouth I had never seen before. My GPS device displayed coordinates that aren't possible. I was standing in day sunlight next to a watercourse I had never seen on any topographical map, but the device told me I was in a place that should have been solid rock hundreds of feet below the surface. After 2 days of hiking, I came across a route that brought me to civilization. I found that the location I described wasn't on any survey when I attempted to report the cave system to geological authorities. There were no cave systems connected to the Bent Creek Ridge waterfall, which was classified as a modest seasonal flow. Jimmy Caldwell was never seen by me again. None of the residents I spoke with recognized him, and the diner where we had first met had no records of hiring somebody with that name. Following that encounter, I ceased caving. I sold everything I owned, gave up on my dissertation, and accepted a position as a high school geology teacher in a state that was landlocked and lacked any notable cave systems. However, I can still hear their calls. On calm evenings, I can hear Maria's voice coming from underground parking garages, basements, even storm drains and subway tunnels. She, Dr. Peterson, my grandmother, and all the other explorers who stayed are still waiting in that phosphorescent chamber. Unbeknownst to us, the underground world is enormous and interconnected. Each cave system is merely a gateway to the more extensive network. Those who sincerely love the dark will eventually find their home in the eternal tunnels. A part of me is still down there, still exploring, still being led by voices that assure me that the ultimate discovery is just around the next bend in the corridor, in the next room. Even though I chose the surface, some invitations to explore are more difficult to decline than others, and the earth remembers everyone who has ever ventured into its depths. Families deserve to know the truth about what transpired with their loved ones in these mountains, which is why I am sharing my tale. I served on the Appalachian search and rescue team for 8 years. I also believed I had witnessed every possible manner the wilderness might take a human life. However, I learned in September of last year that some people are taken rather than going missing. After learning what I did while looking for the Morrison family, I, Lisa Hartwell, realized that not every the goal of a rescue effort is to succeed. After my brother got lost while hiking with me in college in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I earned my certification as a search and rescue volunteer. After 36 hours, he was discovered, hypothermic and dehydrated, but still alive. I trained in wilderness rescue after being inspired by the SAR team who saved him, and I have been responding to calls in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina for almost 10 years. Search and rescue operations are scientifically methodical. We coordinate with helicopter crews, deploy trained search dogs, employ probability maps based on weather and topography, and adhere to proven procedures that have saved thousands of lives. We are aware that most individuals are found within the first 72 hours if they are going to be found alive. Injured persons seek shelter, and hikers usually follow water sources downhill. However, the Morrison case defied every regulation. On a Tuesday morning in late September, the call was received. Two seasoned hikers in their 50s, David and Karen Morrison, had not returned from a 3-day planned hiking trip at the Pisgah National Forest. When they failed to check in at the appointed time on Monday night, their daughter filed a missing persons report. Model hikers were the Morrisons. They had been trekking the Appalachian mountains for more than 20 years, had the appropriate equipment, and had submitted a thorough schedule to the ranger station. They intended to follow a well-traveled circle trail that they had already done several times. These were not unskilled travelers who had strayed from designated routes. On Wednesday morning, our group gathered at the trailhead. A helicopter is on standby, along with 12 volunteers and 2 search dogs. During their scheduled trekking window, the weather had been ideal. No precipitation, warm temperatures, and clear skies. The circumstances were favorable for a fruitful search. We began by tracking their intended path, searching for any indications that it had deviated from the original plan. It seemed typical for the first 8 miles. A granola bar wrapper in their typical location, boot prints that matched their equipment in muddy trail parts, and even a picture they had taken at a picturesque overlook based on the timestamp on a camera they dropped were all signs of their passage. But their trail just disappeared at mile marker 12. In the middle of the trail, the boot prints we had been following abruptly halted. Not slowly, not because they had shifted to rocky ground where it would be more difficult to find tracks, but suddenly, as though David and Karen Morrison had just vanished from the world in the middle of the trip. "This doesn't make sense," stated our team leader, 15-year veteran SAR veteran Tom Bradley. "Individuals don't simply vanish. There's been to serve as an explanation. Assuming they had somehow strayed from the main track, we broadened our search pattern. However, our search dogs, German shepherds with extensive training and hundreds of successful rescues under their belts, were unable to detect any smell trail past the point where the tracks vanished. I became aware of the cameras at that point. Throughout the forest, tiny digital cameras with telephoto lenses were positioned on trees about 8 feet apart. They formed a thorough surveillance network by positioning themselves to offer overlapping coverage of the whole region. The cameras looked to be solar-powered and weatherproof, indicating a long-term installation. I yelled out to Tom, "Do you see these cameras? This location is being watched." However, nothing was visible when Tom and the other team members arrived to take a look. They said I was pointing at trees that were vacant. I was the only one who could see the cameras. I attempted to persuade myself that it was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many challenging searches and insufficient sleep. However, the cameras were too precise and reliable to be my creation. The equipment's serial numbers were visible to me, and LED lights indicated that it was actively recording. We discovered the first Morrison campsite on the second search day. According to their regular procedures, it was set up precisely as their timetable had specified. However, there was a basic problem with the scene. The tent was pitched flawlessly, guidelines taut and properly staked. Their equipment was arranged with military accuracy. Hiking boots are positioned side by side at the tent entrance. Clothing is folded and stowed away, and cooking equipment is cleaned and stored. Rather than being a place where actual people had stayed the night, it appeared to be an advertising for camping gear. However, there were no traces of human habitation, such as scuff marks in the dirt, bent grass from foot traffic, food crumbs, or coffee stains. It appeared as though the campsite had been put together by someone who was familiar with Morrison's camping methods but had never witnessed people using outdoor gear. "This is staged," I informed Tom as I took pictures of the hauntingly flawless campsite. Tom thoroughly inspected the location but disagreed, saying, "Someone set this up to look like the Morrisons were here, but they never actually used this equipment." The search dogs, who were usually eager to work and obedient to commands, sat at the perimeter, whimpering and backing away from the tent. When their handlers attempted to compel them to come closer, the dogs became agitated and attempted to retreat toward the main trail. "Everything looks normal to me, Lisa. Maybe they're just very neat campers." I first heard the voices that night when our team set up camp about a mile from the Morrison site. "Lisa, help us," Karen Morrison's voice, clear and desperate, coming from the direction of their abandoned campsite. "We're trapped. Something's keeping us here." I woke Tom and the other team members, but they didn't hear anything. The forest was quiet except for the typical sounds of wind through trees and distant owl calls, but I could hear the Morrisons clearly pleading for rescue, describing a location that didn't match any terrain feature on our topographical maps. "The cameras are watching us. The watchers won't let us go." On the third day, I hiked alone toward a place that didn't appear on any official maps, following the sound of their voices instead of established search protocols, and the terrain was incorrect to steep, to densely forested, with rock formations that didn't match the local geology. The cameras were everywhere now, not just mounted on trees, but growing out of the ground, growing from rock faces, and blending into the landscape itself. They tracked my movements with mechanical precision, lenses adjusting focus to keep clear images as I went by. Then I discovered the actual Morrison campsite, tucked away in a valley that shouldn't have existed, encircled by mountains that rose unnaturally high above the forest canopy, and exactly as I would have expected from to-season hikers. Gear strewn about, a fire ringed with cold ashes, hiking boots kicking off casually next to a tent that was clearly used. But David and Karen Morrison weren't there. Instead, there were two figures that resembled sophisticated mannequins in hiking poses, but they were obviously artificial, carried their identification, but their faces were featureless and blank. Then they turned to face me with empty eye sockets that contained tiny camera lenses. "The search is over," one of them said in Karen Morrison's voice. "We've been found, safe and sound. Please tell our family we're continuing our hike and we'll be in touch soon." That's when I realized what had happened. The Morrisons hadn't gotten lost. They'd been collected. Something was using the wilderness as a testing ground, monitoring human behavior with a vast network of cameras, and the staged campsite our team had discovered was part of the deception intended to satisfy SAR protocols and end the search without revealing the truth. The mannequins were placeholders meant to provide closure for search and rescue operations, while the real Morrisons were held somewhere the cameras couldn't show me. Occasionally, subjects were taken for closer study. "Where are the real Morrisons?" I demanded. "They are being researched." The mannequins' mechanically precise head tilts, their hiking habits, there I ran. I crashed through the impossible forest, ignoring the camera lenses that tracked my movement from every tree and rock behind me. I could hear the mannequins pursuing, with inhuman speed, their movements too fluid for artificial joints. I let them go. "The study is not finished, but you may join them if you wish. Their gear choices, their decision-making processes under stress. The data is valuable for understanding human wilderness behavior." When I finally arrived at our base camp, I found Tom and the other S members packing equipment. They said the search had been successful. The Morrisons had been found safe and had decided to continue their hiking trip rather than return immediately. But I saw mannequins. I insisted. The people you found weren't human. I put my GPS back toward the main trail, but the device displayed impossible coordinates. The satellite data showed that I was simultaneously at the original search area and 30 meters away in terrain that didn't exist on any map. I tried to show them the pictures I had taken of the cameras, the impossible valley, the artificial Morrisons, but my camera only captured ordinary forest scenes, trees, rocks, and empty trails. The evidence of the surveillance network had been erased or had never existed in the first place. The official report said that David and Karen Morrison had been found unharmed and had refused rescue assistance, opting instead to finish their planned hiking itinerary. Case closed. Successful operation. But I know the truth. Lisa, you've been under a lot of stress. Perhaps you should take a break from senior work. I resigned from the S team after that operation because I knew that some people are taken for reasons we cannot understand. But I still keep an eye on the missing persons reports from the Appalachian region. The names of experienced hikers who go missing without a trace, leaving behind staged campsites and impossible evidence. The families who accept explanations that don't make sense because they need closure more than they need truth. And the Morrisons, out there somewhere between the mapped world and the places the cameras watch, being studied by intelligence that understands human behavior well enough to create perfect mannequins, but doesn't understand why we would sacrifice sleep and safety to search for missing strangers. Search and rescue teams try their best to find the missing, but we can't rescue people who've been taken beyond the boundaries of the world our maps can show. We can only document the carefully staged evidence left behind and tell families that their loved ones chose to continue hiking other than accept help. And sometimes when experienced hikers don't return from well-planned trips, I know they haven't gotten lost. They've been selected for study by something that views human wilderness behavior as data to be collected. The Appalachian Mountains are a laboratory, and we are the subjects being observed. I stopped searching because I couldn't handle finding people who are no longer entirely human, replaced by artificial versions designed to end investigations and provide closure. The mountains keep an eye on everything that moves through their wilderness, and some watchers don't distinguish between observation and collection. We think we're exploring wild places, but sometimes the wild places are exploring us. The cameras remember every hiker who has ever walked these trails, and the surveillance network never stops recording. Most of the data is probably harmless, just observation of human behavior in natural settings. But occasionally the observers decide they need closer study, and seasoned hikers, like the Morrisons, provide the perfect subjects. What I'm about to tell you may seem impossible, but I need people to understand that there are species in these mountains that shouldn't exist, and something is collecting them. 3 months ago, I was tracking what I thought was an endangered black bear population in the Great Smoky Mountains, but instead, I found that the Appalachians are home to a wildlife preserve unlike anything in our scientific understanding. The next time someone you know goes missing in the Appalachian wilderness, keep in mind that not every search ends with rescue. Sometimes the missing stay missing because they're serving a different purpose in places our maps don't show, watched by cameras that exist between the world we know and the one that studies us from the shadows. The project that changed everything was a Grant F-funded study of black bear populations in the most remote parts of the Great Smoky Mountains. I used to be a biologist because after what I found in those remote valleys, I can't look at animal tracks without wondering which ones belong to creatures that exist between our world and somewhere else. I've spent 8 years studying Appalachian wildlife populations, focusing on endangered and threatened species throughout the region, and my specialty is tracking large mammals, bears, elk, mountain lions, and the occasional wolf sighting that is officially non-existent in these mountains. I was dropped off with 2 months' worth of supplies and a scheduled pickup date, along with enough trail cameras and GPS equipment to monitor animal movement throughout the area. The first week was exactly what I had anticipated from remote wildlife research. I documented normal Appalachian fauna, deer, wild boar, raccoons, and the healthy black bear population that showed no obvious subspecies characteristics. Recent sightings suggested that a previously unknown bear subspecies might be living in areas so isolated that they developed unique characteristics. If confirmed, this would be a significant conservation discovery and could result in expanded protection for critical habitat areas. The first anomalous tracks, however, appeared near a stream about 5 miles from my base camp and resembled bear prints, but they were much larger than any black bear I had documented, with claw marks that extended much farther than normal, and a stride length that suggested an animal that was at least 8 feet tall, larger than most grizzly bears, which weren't supposed to exist in the southeastern United States. I cast the prints in plaster and took pictures of them from various angles, but nothing matched when I tried to identify the species using wildlife databases. The closest resemblance was to prehistoric cave bear tracks I'd seen in paleontology textbooks, but those animals had been extinct for 20,000 years. More improbable tracks were discovered over the next few days, wolf tracks from animals that must have weighed more than 200 pounds, bird tracks from something with a wingspan that would require a creature larger than any known raptor, bears that walk solely on their hind legs, maintaining perfect posture like humans, deer that moved in formation and kept prints the size of dinner plates that belonged to no known North American feline species. On top of this, my trail cameras were recording stranger footage. I tried to radio my research coordinator to report the findings, but my satellite phone couldn't establish connection despite showing full signal strength, and the GPS coordinates on my equipment showed impossible readings. Birds flew in geometrically perfect patterns, creating aerial displays that looked purposefully choreographed. However, the most unsettling footage showed animals that seemed to be watching the cameras themselves. A massive black bear would approach a camera, study it carefully, then position itself to avoid the motion sensor while remaining visible in the frame, if it understood the technology, and was purposefully being photographed as if it understood the technology. When I followed a game trail toward higher elevation, I crested a ridge and found myself looking down into a valley that shouldn't have existed. The terrain was too flat, too circular, surrounded by peaks that rose impossibly high above the forest canopy, and in the middle of the valley was a structure that appeared to be a combination research laboratory and wildlife preserve. The enclosures across the valley floor were filled with animals I had never seen before, some of which appeared to be evolutionary throwbacks to then. They were the missing people in the largest enclosures, some of whom I recognized from missing person reports I'd seen, hunters, researchers, and hikers who had vanished in the Appalachian wilderness over the past few years, moving with the same choreographed precision I'd seen in the trail camera footage, following invisible commands and maintaining perfect formation as they walked predetermined paths around their enclosures, still looking human, but their eyes held the same vacant intelligence I'd seen in the animals. At the edge of the facility stood figures dressed in what appeared to be park ranger uniforms, but their movements were too fluid, their proportions slightly off, and they watched the enclosures with scientific interest, occasionally taking notes on devices that looked like clipboards but appeared to be made of materials that didn't exist in nature. One of them noticed me, and it turned mechanically toward my observation point, and I found myself staring at something that wore a human face like a mask, its features perfect but expressionless, its eyes reflecting light like an animal. I could tell that its fingers had too many joints when it raised what might have been a welcoming hand. Doctor, I realized that my entire study had been planned. The grant funding, the remote location, the 2-month isolation period, everything had been planned to bring me to this place at the right time. My trail cameras hadn't been documenting wildlife behavior. They were documenting my behavior for something that was studying human behavior. Chen, it called out, and its voice carried flawlessly over the impossibly long distance. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Your research has been very helpful in identifying suitable specimens. Researchers, the same way we examined animals. You are a perfect fit for our collection because of your proficiency in tracking animals, the figure added. You are sufficiently knowledgeable about animal behavior to recognize our preserve's beauty. Field biologists, park rangers, animal photographers, and other researchers who had been included into the facility's collection were now visible in the human enclosures. Like the impossible animals, they moved with purpose, adhering to invisible commands and preserving patterns that had uses that were incomprehensible to humans. The figure started to ascend the ridge toward my location, going more quickly than the steep terrain should have permitted. Other uniformed individuals appeared behind it, emerging from concealed locations around the building. They had been observing me the whole time, letting me study how they worked before they came near. I took off running, leaving all my study gear behind. I smashed through the trees and headed in what I assumed was the direction of my base camp. I could hear them behind me, not running, but at the same steady pace that made it sound like they knew I couldn't get away. As I jogged, my GPS device displayed inconsistent readings, coordinates that put me in several different places at once. Trails appeared and vanished to lead me away from possible escape routes, giving the impression that the forest itself was changing. However, I recalled the basic wildlife tracking guideline. Water sources are followed by animals in an attempt to locate the stream that went back to familiar area. I disregarded my GPS and followed the sound of flowing water. After several hours, feeling tired and confused, I stumbled upon a hiking trail that had official Park Service blazes. On it, a very human park ranger voiced concern about a lone hiker leaving restricted wilderness regions without the required permits at the ranger station where the path led. Upon attempting to report the facility and the missing persons collection, I found that my research grant had never been awarded. The university didn't have any record of financing my research, and there was no mention of the helicopter drop-off in the Park Service flight logs that I could recall. I left GPS devices and trail cameras in the forest, but they were never recovered. Official records show that I had never been given permission to do research in the region where I claimed to have been working, even after Park Service officers searched the area extensively. However, my tracking abilities that helped me avoid recapture also made me useful to that collection site. I've learned to spot the telltale indicators of their observation, such as overly synchronized animal behavior, track patterns that point to unthinkable species, and too convenient wildlife picture possibilities. The collecting facility continues to collect specimens for uses that are beyond the scope of human science. I currently teach biology in a landlocked high school, state with no notable wilderness regions, although occasionally I get offers for jobs doing animal study in isolated areas. Always receiving funding from non-existent organizations and needing expertise. That is exactly what I possess. There is a preserve in the Appalachian mountains that gathers rare species. Of all the specimens, human researchers are one of the rarest. Something is looking at our research strategies, examining our methods of observation, and perhaps concluding that our knowledge would be more useful as part of their collection than as separate researchers, even though I decline to be displayed in their facilities. I am aware that they are still observing. Every environmental photo I see, every animal video I'm constantly assessing if an animal's track is an example of natural activity or a well-coordinated performance by specimens that exist to showcase the elegance of scientific collections. Some studies are made to recruit researchers themselves, and the mountains remember all the researchers who have ever examined their species. Sometimes the animals are documenting us for intelligence that values scientific methods enough to want it saved forever, even though we believe we are documenting animal behavior. Some wildlife preserves aren't designed to release their specimens back into the wild, so keep that in mind if you're given the chance to research endangered animals in far-flung places, particularly if the funding source is unclear and the isolation period is lengthy. Some researchers end up becoming the most valuable exhibits of all, and some collections are made to last forever. There are many animals in the Highlands that shouldn't be there. They protect what they value, led by intellect that knows conservation better than we do. And among the rarest species in their collection are devoted researchers. We believed we were getting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Half the usual price for a luxurious cabin in the Smoky Mountains. However, some establishments are inexpensive because no one ever complains about the accommodations while they are there. My name is Emily, and the events of that anniversary weekend almost ruined both my sense of reality and our relationship. Since the same rental listing keeps coming up, I feel compelled to share this experience. Additionally, I can't allow other couples to make the same mistake. 4 months, my husband Jake and I had been anticipating our 5th anniversary. Finally, after years of hard work and tight budgets, we had enough saved up for a romantic vacation. We desired somewhere unique, a location apart from the trappings of daily life, where we could rekindle our relationship. It looked too good to be true when we came across the listing for a luxurious property in the Great Smoky Mountains. The pictures showed a gorgeous log cabin on a mountainside with a wraparound deck with a hot tub, a stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over foggy valleys. Modern conveniences, total seclusion, and hiking trails just outside the door were all promised in the description. However, the cost was startlingly low, less than half the price of comparable houses. It was a strangely bare webpage, just a basic booking form, an email address, and no firm name or phone number. Since there were no reviews, we figured it had just been listed. Whispering Pines Retreat was the name given to the facility, and the images appeared to be taken by a professional. Therefore, we made the reservation right away without hesitation. The email confirmation was short. We appreciate you selecting Whispering Pines. Have fun while you're there. When you arrive, the cabin will be prepared. No contact details, no directions for check-in, and no mention of keys or access credentials. Jake attempted to respond with a request for more information, but the email was returned as undeliverable. On a Friday afternoon in early October, we followed the GPS coordinates on the booking confirmation and drove down from Ohio. The path led us past tourist villages, down narrower roads, and farther and more into the mountains. We didn't see any more cars, houses, or indications of civilization for the final 20 miles. Jake questioned, "Are you sure we're going the right way?" As our automobile ascended a steep dirt road that appeared to be only big enough for one car. I looked at the GPS once again. When we eventually arrived at what seemed to be our goal, the sun was already lowering. This is definitely it. Maybe they wanted to emphasize the complete privacy part of the listing, a wood cottage in a forest, clearing that matched the pictures completely, with warm light glowing in the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. It was lovely in the golden light. It was obvious that someone had arranged for our arrival. However, something didn't feel right when we parked and got out of the vehicle. It was too quiet. There were no insects buzzing, no birds singing, and no wind stirring the trees. The whole woodland seemed to be holding its breath. A letter on the kitchen counter unlocked the front door. "Here at Whispering Pines. Welcome. You've got everything you need. Have fun while you're there." The handwriting, which appeared to have been created using a fountain pen, was sophisticated but archaic. The cabin was just as described and in perfect condition. The rustic furnishings had a high-end appearance. One wall was dominated by a stone fireplace, and the deck offered stunning views. However, it had the air of a museum exhibit rather than a real location where people lived and unwinded. We tried to settle in after unpacking, but little things kept getting in the way. There was food in the refrigerator that we hadn't asked for. Local honey, fresh bread, and wine that appeared to be decades old. The closets held old clothing that appeared to have been waiting for us, all in our exact sizes. Additionally, our phones displayed no reception at all, even though the reservation confirmation indicated Wi-Fi and cell service. This is strange. As we sat on the terrace sipping glasses of the enigmatic wine, I said to Jake, "You mean that?" "I mean, how did they know what food to get? How did they know our sizes?" Jake sighed. "Perhaps they offer a typical welcome bundle." This type of behavior is definitely common among the wealthy. I had a hard time falling asleep that first night. I could sense someone watching us through the big windows, and the silence outside was deafening. When I got up to draw the curtains at 3 in the morning, I noticed something that made my blood boil. Freeze, lights flickered through the jungle. Soft flickering glows, like candles held by invisible hands, instead of headlamps or flashlights. They stayed just out of sight at all times, drifting between the trees and steady, deliberate movements. I shook Jake awake with a whisper. "Gaze outside." However, the lights had gone out by the time he joined me at the window. On the coffee table the following morning, we discovered a leather-bound visitor book that had not been there the previous evening. Entries from couples who had stayed at the cabin since the 1970s were all over it. Early arrivals were ebullient, complimenting the opulent lodgings and the stunning setting. However, the entries' tone evolved as we read through the years. After their vacation ended, guests started talking about experiencing weird nightmares, feeling watched, and finding it hard to leave. A few entries stopped in the middle of sentences. Others were written in handwriting that became more and more chaotic, as though the authors were losing their sense of reality. Only 2 weeks before to our arrival, the most recent entry was made. The handwriting was unsteady. Day 12. The car won't start, and we were meant to depart yesterday. The trails keep taking us back here. Even though Jake says we should hike out, the cabin is against us leaving. Don't stay after your checkout time if someone discovers this. Avoid letting it hold you back. As I showed Jake the entry, my hands were trembling. "We must go," I said. Now, Jake, though, was oddly composed. Most likely, folks are merely attempting to frighten potential visitors. These mountain villages may be, they enjoy ghost stories and legends. His voice seemed flat and distant, and I could tell he was speaking differently. I saw that his eyes lacked concentration, as if he wasn't really there. We attempted to trek in order to decompress, but the paths surrounding the cabin were uncooperative. The paths twisted back toward the cabin, from where they should have proceeded down the mountain. There were trail markings pointing in directions that were geographically illogical. We were worn out and bewildered when we returned to the deck of the cabin after 3 hours of hiking. I was investigating the cabin's basement that afternoon when I came across something that reaffirmed my worst suspicions. A wall behind a pile of antique furniture was covered in pictures. There were dozens of couples in front of the cottage, all about our age, posing joyfully. Based on the attire and haircuts, the images were taken over several decades. However, this is what screamed out of me. Jake and I were in the most current image captured in contemporary color. Wearing clothes I didn't recognize, we were on the deck of the cabin, holding hands and grinning. Someone had written, in that same exquisite handwriting, at the bottom of the picture, "The Richardsons, October 2024. They decided to stay forever." I hurried upstairs to look for Jake, but he was staring into the fire with that same blank look while sitting still in front of the fireplace. "We must leave now, Jake. This place has a serious problem." His eyes briefly cleared as he turned to face me. "What's up with me, Emily? I feel as though I'm vanishing." I realized then that the cabin was doing more than just physically trapping people. Their personality, their will to leave, and their ties to the outside world were being gradually erased. It kept couples as permanent visitors until they forgot they had ever lived anyplace else, feeding off their joy and love. I took our car keys. I drew Jake to the door, but he struggled, his blank expression coming back. Why would we go? We arrived. Just now. 3 nights were paid for. The vehicle refused to start. As though something was stopping it from starting, the engine spun over, but refused to catch. I tried using my phone, Jake's phone, and even an ancient landline that I discovered in the kitchen of the cabin. Nothing was successful. I heard voices outside as darkness fell. There were dozens of them, all using the same lifeless, flat voice that Jake had been using. They were calling our names and extending invitations to join them for sports, food, and an endless, eternal vacation. Jake was waiting to go outside when I caught him standing at the front door with his hand on the handle. Freely said, "There, our friends." They had been anticipating our arrival. They wished to give us a tour of the grounds. I had to make a snap decision. The guest book entry about not staying past checkout came back to me. Time. We had a reservation through Sunday. Good morning. Perhaps that was the secret. I snatched up the guest book and tore out all the pages that had our names or pictures. I saw them burn after tossing them into the fireplace. Jake sprang back to consciousness as the evidence of our stay was obliterated by the flames. What's going on? Emily, where are we? Outside, the shouts became irate, no longer welcoming and friendly. The cabin started to tremble, as though a huge object were hitting it from all sides. The lights flashed violently and the windows cracked. However, the vehicle began. After throwing our belongings in the back seat, we accelerated beyond the speed limit on that gravel lane and continued driving until we came to the main highway. I could see the lights in the cabin dimming in the rearview mirror, and for a while, it appeared as though the whole building was melting into the fog. The rental webpage was no longer up when we returned home and looked for it. There was no charge on our credit card for the reservation, as though whispering there had never been Pinesy's retreat. However, occasionally on calm evenings when Jake and when we are at home together, we experience the same emotion. A light tug at there is a voice in the back of our thoughts telling us that our true home is in the mountains, waiting for us. Since then, we've relocated twice, but we are followed by the feeling. The mountains keep their visitors in mind, and it's more difficult to turn down some invitations than others. Never trust a rental that looks too good to be true. Your intuition, because past visitors never return to post negative ratings. Certain establishments are inexpensive.